tools or even the code integrity, we'll be discussing the challenges and why security across the software development lifecycle environments remains very low. First, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded, so you can go back and review it on our YouTube page. And definitely ask questions in the Q&A area along the way. We'll make sure we get to them either during or at the end of the presentation. So a little bit about Trusted Sec. In looking across the full life cycle of your program, Trusted Sec can help with building the program with risk, program and compliance reviews and readiness testing, not only penetration testing, but customized testing as well. A lot going on in this space, as you might imagine. Fixing the remediation of those issues with security solutions. And finally, we also help with responding to any incidents that your program has. There really is no finish line. A few services I'd like to highlight because we'll be talking about them today or touching on them in some way is first off, the Purple Team, the adversarial detection and countermeasures. This improves the ability of your team through both offensive testing and defensive safeguards. Really been extremely popular and growing in the value to organizations as they mature. And next is the baseline configuration and hardening reviews. Most recently is the DevSecOps configuration review. And that goes over the development with code repository controls and registries, the delivery platform integrations, access and configurations, application platform, cloud infrastructure controls, and the observability for logs and alerting. Pretty important to identify vulnerabilities earlier in the life cycle, evaluate those impacts of the security tooling, and identify additional opportunities for continuous security. Okay, on to our speakers today. Mitch Parish, who heads up the DevSecOps config reviews, and Mike Spitzer, who is the senior software engineer in our defense and countermeasures team. Mike, take it away.
Good afternoon. Like I said, my name is Mike Spitzer. I have almost 25 years in infrastructure and defense, and the last probably 6-7 years have been largely devoted to the Purple Team activities that we do, internal pen testing, SIM configuration, and also DevOps, CI/CD, and a lot of automation, especially through Ansible. So I've had to live through the horror that is supply chain. And we also have Mitch Parish with us.
Yeah, I'm Mitch Parish. I'm a security consultant here at Trusted Sec on the remediation services team. And as Stephen mentioned, kind of focus on DevSecOps in the cloud security space. Before Trusted Sec, was a DevOps engineer for a few places, so I know the pain points of that methodology and practice. And then before that, spent 8 years with the federal government at the Department of Homeland Security. So glad to be here today. And as Stephen mentioned, feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we'll address those as we go. And then we'll also have some time at the end to kind of go over those if we've got time. Cool. So let's start out talking about what exactly is the software supply chain and why so many people seem to be caring about it recently. To maintain development velocity, software development has increasingly shifted from developers coding functionalities themselves to assembling applications via a combination of proprietary and open source code. So applications, like I said, are relying more and more on these third-party components and open source components, including software packages, modules, container images, the build platforms themselves, the plugins that are oftentimes also open source components for the build and delivery platforms, and then just build artifacts of any kind. So essentially, the supply chain consists of all of these components, all of these dependencies making their way through the software development lifecycle to an eventual consumer, right? We're composing our software, our product out of a bunch of different parts sourced from many different places, shipping them through our process to an eventual consumer. So that in a nutshell is the software supply chain. So what's the problem with that? That kind of seems like, especially in the manufacturing space, a very common practice. In the software development space, the adoption of this is growing and exploding exponentially. And we'll talk about more specific numbers of adoption later on. But first, let's jump into the problem. The distributed nature, like I said, meaning you're getting all of your components, you're grabbing those from third parties, including open source projects. That really results in a lack of visibility across the entire supply chain. And when we talk about these third-party components, we really have to look at both direct and transitive or dependent dependencies, which represent inherited risk from the components your components are built with. So Mike will talk a little bit more about that later on. But pretty soon you start to see the sprawl from importing these packages gets pretty big because you're pulling from all different sources, you're compiling it into your application, and maintaining visibility over all of those packages can be a very big challenge. Down on top of that, you've got to continue to deal with traditional struggles of IT and software development, namely poor asset management, which we see all the time, knowing what exists in your environment, and then a lack of security controls along the way. So there's always going to be potential for what's essential shadow IT. So what you're doing to protect and control your environment for those unknowns is really vital. So I said the software supply chain made up of many different components. So therefore it's as strong as its weakest link. So if you think back to that arrow diagram, I think we've got another copy on a coming slide of the development lifecycle. Attackers have many opportunities to find the easiest point of entry along the way. And once they find it, that single compromise has the potential for widespread impact downstream, which essentially means the consumers of that particular component that you might be developing, whether it's a package, container images or whatnot, downstream can in fact or impact other packages, applications, or even end users. So the potential for widespread impact based on a single compromise is huge. And this again is a diagram of the software delivery lifecycle and kind of some of the areas of vulnerability, which looking at this, pretty much you can assume that it's most of them. Starting out from bypassing simple security controls, such as code review, compromising source code, your source code management system, and then moving on into the build phase, which your build platform is likely an open source platform, or at least it has open source components, such as plugins built in, or that you've added. So at that stage, you can modify, a thread is code modification after source control. Also build platform compromise, bypassing CI/CD, or altering the CI/CD pipeline configuration files themselves. Compromising a package repository, using a bad package or dependency. So really, through automation, we've been able to greatly increase development velocity and delivery velocity, but along the way, through the introduction of these automated platforms, we've also increased the attack surface. And like I said, the weakest link is the one that attackers would look for to introduce that initial compromise. If I can do the next slide. Cool. So we know about the software supply chain. We know a little bit about the problem. We'll kind of talk more on that in later detail. But let's jump into the scope with some numbers. So as you can see by these graphs, the adoption of open source is completely exploding. Seeing huge increases in package downloads, and these represent, these 4 programming languages. You can see you can see the percentages there, just the year-over-year increase. Python's seeing a 92% increase, like who would have guessed that one? JavaScript, total downloads for 2021, 1.5 million. And these are packages from public registries, is what these numbers represent. So just a dramatic increase in the adoption of open source components. And these numbers kind of show the same thing, but in totality. You can see 37 million total project versions, annual download volume of 2.2 trillion, and then vulnerability density over there on the right as well, 29%. So just the total growth, pretty insane for adoption of open source components. And that kind of goes just to show you the scope of the issue, and why the supply chain has become such an important focus of security. All right, we'll talk briefly about some kind of high-level types of attacks. Mike will kind of go into detail on some of these in the wild in some later slides, but we can talk about a few to kind of get a better understanding of how vulnerabilities are being introduced into the supply chain. So first, you've got dependency confusion, which was actually the #1 supply chain attack of 2021. And this attackers essentially determine the name of a proprietary inner source package with an organization and register a package with that exact same name, but a newer semantic version on a public registry. So if that organization's build platform isn't configured to enforce repository trust, then there's a chance that these malicious packages could be pulled from a public registry instead. Like I said, that was the number one supply chain attack that we saw in 2021. The second, typo squatting, a little more indirect, kind of a shot in the dark shotgun approach. And that was the second most common attack in 2021. It essentially relies on developers making pretty much otherwise innocent typos when adding packages to their projects. And for most of us who have spent 2 hours debugging some code to find that we made a single typo along the way, you can understand that that's a legitimate attack vector. So what essentially happens there is a malicious package will be added to a registry under a name very similar to a legitimate package, on the hope that at some point the developer will make a typo and that package will be inserted into someone's application. Malicious code injection kind of encompasses a lot of different vectors, but it involves injecting malicious code directly into a project's repository. It can be done through stolen credentials. That's why access management is so important. That's why MFA is so important. The number of MFA on package maintainer registry platforms is pretty terrifying. Also can be done through tool tampering, or even malicious intent of project contributors themselves, either bypassing peer review or peer review requirements aren't in place to begin with. And we'll talk more kind of about some mitigating factors on this later on. So with that, I will pass it over to Mike, who's going to talk a little bit about some examples in the wild that we've seen.
Yeah, so before you can defend, you have to understand what types of attacks are going to be coming to your way. You have to know what you're really defending against. So we pulled a few high-profile examples.
I'll get it eventually, sorry.
There you go, yeah. Yeah, event stream, Ruby gems. It's going to look like we're picking on NPM a lot, and I am, but I'm not. The first one was the event stream incident. So event stream was an npm package that had been compromised. So the attack was actually targeting the copay application. So it was targeting users of a specific application. So if you didn't use this app, you weren't in danger, you didn't notice anything, but it would clear people's Bitcoin accounts if they were using copay. And it was out there for a little while. There was some code that had been injected to it, and anybody installing this would have had no real visibility into what had happened. We later had the Ruby Gems attack, and that was, Mitch mentioned typo squatting. There were 725 packages that were identified where the names have been slightly modified. So it was a dash instead of an underscore, that kind of thing. The typical way to do typo squatting is you're going to clone all of the existing code so that if somebody does download it, it's still going to work the way they expect. Any documentation that goes with it will still work, but they've added pieces. They did find that those packages were downloaded well over 100,000 times, though not all of them would have actually been used. A lot of that would have been automated testing and that kind of thing. It doesn't mean that it got distributed, but you still have to be concerned that you don't know what's coming into your pipeline. We later found UA parser. That was a JavaScript library. This is npm again. That installed a password stealer. It was also a crypto miner. And that was done by the developer. His account was hacked. And I'm not sure how that happened. Weak password reuse, doesn't really matter. It looked like a legit package. It had been signed. It came from the right place. There was nothing that would have stood out as being malicious. However, and it was noticed quickly. The problem is when it's being downloaded millions of times a week and not necessarily being updated every time, you don't know how far this type of attack can reach. Then we have targeted attacks. This is another npm package of Node IPC. I took a screenshot from a GitHub issue that had been brought up. What happened in protest to the Russia and Ukraine war, the developer had placed some code that would do some geolocation. And if it determined that the code was being executed in Russia or Belarus, it would start wiping all data on the machine. And that was dangerous for many reasons, but also came under fire for really undermining any trust that had been built in the open source community. So it was damaging from a reputation standpoint, along with the data that had been destroyed. And then finally, the one everyone probably knows about is the Solarwinds attack. So everything that we've discussed previously has been you as a company are doing software development, you pull in a package, and now there's a security issue. There's something that's been ingested with that. The SolarWinds supply chain attack was not like that. It was farther down the stream where the vendor had been compromised. And so everyone who installed this package, which is a trusted package from a trusted company, was now vulnerable to this backdoor that had been placed into their system. And this went on for months. We're not actually sure how long it was going on. And we're still not sure, and probably won't know for years, what the actual damage was. It was such an extreme compromise amongst so many verticals. This hit government, this hit oil and gas, this hit education. I don't know that anybody really was spared. And this was an APT attack. So it was a government behind it with a lot of time and a lot of resources. And that's honestly just an incredibly hard thing to defend against. But just because it's hard to commit to, hard to defend against doesn't mean we can't try. So as an example of the idea of sprawl and the idea of dependencies and what you're dealing with, I took a look at, as a primarily Python developer, I looked at the most used Python package, and that was Botto3, which is the API interface for Amazon Web Services. You can see here over 250 million downloads in March. That's really common. If you use AWS and you're doing automation with Python, almost guaranteed you're using this package. Now, at a minimum, you can see on the left of the slide, those 14 packages will be installed. Those are required dependencies for Botto3. And you can see in there that 2 of the required packages are developed by AWS. The rest are either an organization or just have an individual name as the author. And that doesn't mean that that's the only person working on this package. It just means that there's not a company behind it. There's not, you don't know what kind of oversight is going into these packages. Now, they have an advantage of being open source, so you can look at the code. And I know that they're doing due diligence, but unless you yourself are reviewing all the code, you don't really know what's getting in there. If you require some of the optional packages that are under those 14, I had gotten to like 74 before I stopped counting, because there was no end in sight. So when you start getting into optional dependencies, as you're trying to increase the abilities of your software, you don't know what you're going to be getting into.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too, a lot of these packages are maintained by a handful of people. It's not their primary, obviously not their primary full-time job. It's a hobby or a project that they work on. So, not necessarily all the resources are available to them as far as, the time and effort to really secure these packages as best they can.
And when you look at, and we'll get into this more with defense, when you get into some of the some of the applications that can do automatic code scanning and look for vulnerabilities and help with that, often come with a heavy price tag.
Yes.
That limits them to enterprise use. So this one guy who had an idea and writes a package for it doesn't necessarily have access to those resources. So you can't count on that automation being a part of it. So then we have the next problem, which is asset inventory. And this is just knowing what is in your environment. And my experience has been throughout my 25 years of doing this has been that asset inventory is almost always terrible. And you can't secure what you don't know you have. So prioritize, even outside of supply chain, you need to prioritize getting your asset inventory and getting it up to date. So I pulled some stats, and the stats, these are the best stats I could find, but they seem low to me. 43% of organizations are tracking inventory with spreadsheets. I'm surprised it's not higher. 56% don't manage the entire life cycle. And I would say it's probably more than that, because I doubt any of those organizations actually know their assets. 60% are missing key information to manage those assets. I'm surprised that's not closer to 100. And missing key information could be anything from purchase date to when is the end of life, when does support stop, when can you write it off? You don't. There's a lot of information there. Login abilities, and then even beyond that, when you get into things like the ILOMs and you're looking at remote management, those tend to get lost frequently. And on pen tests, we find many times where we're able to connect to the host with a default credential because nobody ever configured it. It's not actively being managed as an asset. Whereas an ILO is technically, it's almost like another machine that has to be managed separately. 29% spend excess hours reconciling inventory and assets. We used to do that every year. Everybody should. Well, everybody should have an up-to-date inventory, but you do need to reconcile. And then 28% spend excess hours dealing with out of warranty and out of support assets. And that often comes from the life cycle and missing key information. I can't tell you how many times I called for support on something that I believed was under support that was not. And so this is a very common issue. Most of those numbers should be really close to 100%. I'm convinced some people were lying when they answered that poll.
Yeah, I'd like to know the percentage of organizations that track inventory with spreadsheets and Google Docs.
Absolutely, it's got to be higher than that.
I've personally seen quite a few times. So
even companies that utilize asset inventory trackers like ServiceNow often still have what they call a backup in a spreadsheet.
Yeah.
So then you have another problem that I've run into many times, which is shadow IT. And for those who don't know, shadow IT is IT assets that your IT group doesn't know about. So you have a manager who has a project that wants to get done. He rents a VPC, pays for it on a credit card, starts hosting things on there. You're now serving up company data on an unknown AWS asset or an unknown virtual like a Linode. You have no idea what's going on. I've had servers that were plugged in that I didn't know about because a developer managed to get access to the server room, and you can't track that unless you're going through and you happen to notice, hey, that doesn't look familiar. But especially as things move into the cloud, you have to set a policy, and it has to be enforced that's not wild west. You can't spin up anything you want when you want because you're in a hurry and you can't wait for IT to do their due diligence. So there has to be a policy in place.
Yes, and I would say that's one of the primary findings we have when we're doing cloud configuration reviews is finding resources that are misconfigured that they had no idea that were there, just because, like you said, cloud makes it so much easier to create things. And developers and engineers will go in and do walkthroughs and forget to tear down resources. And there's just a ton of ways that shadow IT can get introduced into your environment. So
I was at a client one time where we saw that every day in the late afternoon, there was a multi-gig upload to Ukraine from this single machine. And we said, what is this machine? And they said, we have no idea. And they had to look into it. And it did turn out it was legitimate traffic, but it was their marketing team was sending this batch of stuff to another company every day and had worked out how to do it using one of their existing machines without involving IT.
Yeah, exactly.
And so there was a little bit of panic as we were on this engagement as we tried to figure out what was being exfiltrated. We have a question here. How many companies track a KPI, KRI around inventory misses? A device shows up on your network that doesn't tie back to your source of truth inventory listing. My experience is very few.
Yeah.
We do find a few. Most of them have implemented something like Cisco ICE, where if they don't already know the MAC, if it doesn't meet their specs, it's not allowed to get an IP. So I've had that cause me problems when I'm trying to do pen tests, especially on site. So there are a few that do, but many, even if they try, get overwhelmed.
Yes.
People who are on here, I'm thinking most of you are going to be IT. And so you know that when cuts come, IT is often at the front. And so it's a race to do more with less. And certain things go. And a lot of times because of just the amount of effort, security sometimes takes a back seat. So some stats for shadow IT, 80% of workers admit to using SaaS applications at work without IT approval. That seemed a little high, but I'm actually not surprised. Shadow IT cloud usage is estimated to be at 10 times known cloud usage. And in my experiences with clients, I believe that. There is so much inventory out there where it's so quick to spin up an EC2 instance, for example, that especially if you're a heavy development environment, where developers have API keys and they have access to spin things up, which makes sense when you're trying to develop quickly. A lot of stuff gets built that the IT group doesn't know about. And it's not necessarily done to any kind of standard that somebody familiar with security would do. Having been a developer myself, I know there's a lot of, well, this works, so it must be fine.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say not to pick on GCP, but GCP especially is an offender in this space where they make creating projects under organizations so easy. And most organizations that I've seen aren't restricting that. So you go and you look at organizational projects and it's just, you can tell by the name, like the default name of the projects, that it's like my first project or so-and-so walkthrough. And you just shake your head and nothing's been done. So it's just a compounding problem. So absolutely knowing what you have and what's out there is just vital.
Now there are entire companies now that have been built up around monitoring your cloud assets and letting you know what new was created, and automated scanning for permissions and looking for some of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to security. But again, there's going to be a cost to that. Not everybody has the resources to throw around.
Yeah, and that's kind of another thing that's come up from this is the whole financial ops side of things, where cloud costs have become so exorbitant that there has to be, like you said, a financial person that's just looking at bills to see what resources are out there and trying to reconcile them with the infrastructure teams to say, like, is this actually what we need?
Right.
And when we get to the point where we're relying on financial auditors to know what our resources are, we're not in a great shape.
No, you're in terrible shape at that point. And then it becomes a fight with the business of knowing of the business understanding the cost of a breach versus the cost of securing. So many companies, from a financial standpoint, you say, well, we can use this tool, and they say, oh, that's too expensive. But then if a breach happens, you have that realization that it would have been far cheaper to secure it in the first place, both from a financial standpoint and from a reputation. Now, this stat really stood out to me. The average company has 975 unknown cloud services, and most companies have over 108. So if the mean is 108, then that tells you that 975, there's a lot of companies with way more. Somebody's really throwing that average. And I'm going to guess the larger the company, the easier it is to essentially hide those assets, where you can spin things up and nobody's going to notice because there's already so much money being thrown out.
Yeah, no, exactly.
35% of employees said they have to work around security policies to get their jobs done. In almost every case that I've actually talked to an employee where that was the case, or where they said that was the case, it was not. They absolutely could have gotten their jobs done, but they didn't like what they had to do to get their job done. And so they find a way to circumvent IT. And it's almost always been to the detriment of security. 21% of organizations do not have a new technology policy. That number seems reasonable to me because most organizations do have a new technology policy. It's mostly smaller ones who do not. The problem mostly comes from even the ones that do don't always enforce it. And so enforcement becomes an issue there. So I'll hand it back over to Mitch.
Yeah. So with all that said, things kind of sound pretty bad, hard to manage, a big issue. So what exactly can we do about it? And I always like to start with looking at the basics, making sure you're executing the basics, starting, as far left as development, adopting a coding standard is vitally important. There's no shortage of frameworks out there. We've listed NIST's Secure Development Framework, Secure Software Development Framework, and OWASP's Application Security Verification Standard. The important thing here is to find one, adopt it, and really pay attention and enforce the standards it lays out. So that's whether it's input validation, threat modeling, or testing. And instead of having a scattered strategy, you need to find a coding standard, vet it, make sure it works for your organization, and then 100% be behind it. Designing with intention, and Mike, you may want to jump in on this too, but following the practice of you aren't going to need it, which essentially satisfying your acceptance criteria, writing the minimum amount of code to solve the problem. Don't include anything you don't need, just simple design principles. And this would pertain to the application platform too, right? So if you're running container-based workloads, make sure you're using secure base images. You're not installing any packages or anything that's unnecessary. Skipped ahead there. And also important to know what you're inheriting, right? And we'll talk about SBOM here in a minute. But when you're looking to add a new software package to solve a problem or implement a feature, take a second to evaluate its dependency tree, know what else you're getting into. There's a ton of resources out there now for evaluating software dependencies. Sneak Advisor is a really good platform. Deps.dev, OpenSSF has a metrics website as well as their scorecard program, which just allows project maintainers to automate the assessment of security controls. And it gives consumers of those components a really good viewpoint into compliance with those controls. So a lot of resources out there for doing your due diligence and research into any software packages you might be picking up.
So one thing I've seen from some companies is that they don't allow direct installs from, say, NPM or PyPI.
Right.
Everything has to be reviewed locally and stored in a local repository. And then you install from that. And that means that all of that code has been reviewed. The problem comes from the amount of effort involved in that. Most companies can't support that kind of workload. And the smaller ones that try end up with repositories that are far out of date.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you're seeing more and more artifact registries being available through like Google Artifact Registry, Azure DevOps. But exactly to Mike's point, there's got to be a process for updating those packages once they're there. And that's something that's super easy to fall through the cracks. Enforce code reviews. Seems like a pretty simple standard security control, but you need to make sure this is being enforced. The goal here is just to have 4 eyes on new code before it gets purged. And there's many ways to implement this through whichever source code management platform you're using. Code owners, really great tool, really allows you to be granular for defining who owns what specific parts of a project, and what review requirements are there. Access management, everyone's favorite topic. Never get tired of hearing about. Just make sure MFA is enabled everywhere, especially on your source code management platforms. Your build and delivery platforms, absolutely vital. There's more and more attacks against CI/CD platforms, and I'll kind of talk about that more in a minute.
Yeah, adding code signing to that is a huge value as well. Where you're validating where that code comes from.
Yeah,
absolutely. Or who it comes from.
Yeah. And I'll touch on that too in the next slide. All the major platforms offer verified code signing requirements. It's something that you absolutely need to be doing. And that kind of goes into the fact, like, this is defense in depth principles. Of course, code signing certificates can get compromised, but having these other controls in place helps to mitigate that. Right, there's not a one-stop shop for controlling this. A good point. I would say make sure you're performing at least a minimum amount of auditing to identify and remove access. I logged into a dormant account of mine a few months ago and saw that I still had maintainer access to a few organizations, not just specific projects, but organization-wide access on projects and organizations that I haven't worked on for years. So this is important for anybody contributing anything to open source projects and you're not active or you don't plan to be. Let the organization or project maintainers know. And you can also usually leave those organizations yourself manually. And then finally, as a DevOps person, I'd be remiss of me not to reinforce the access restrictions on your build and delivery platforms. Not everyone on your development team or other teams needs access to Jenkins. I promise you that. So limiting access.
Very true.
Huge. And that kind of leads me more into the asset management configuration or asset and configuration management topic. I mostly mean build and delivery platforms in that, because I've seen so many times they're built and once code is being successfully built and deployed, they're kind of largely forgotten until they break, which leads to the all too common panic fix. And then you give a good sigh and move on to the next thing. But we really need to focus on maintaining build and delivery platforms as production assets, because that's what they are. So applying the same level of scrutiny and monitoring, make sure you're patching. There's so many automated tools out there to set that up to alleviate some of the workload. And then stay as minimal as possible. If you've got a huge amount of plugins, make sure you're auditing those, make sure you're updating those, remove them if they're no longer updated. We've all seen Jenkins plugins that haven't been maintained in 4 years, but they're still there in someone's Jenkins configuration. And then finally, monitoring your build and delivery actions as much as possible, be it through Slack or Teams. just having some visibility on when those platforms are building and delivering. For organizations that deliver 100 times a day, it's a little harder, but if you're delivering a handful of times a day, it's so much easier to have visibility into suspicious build and delivery actions that are happening outside of normal hours, or at just suspicious times. So definitely recommend setting up some type of monitoring for those actions. All right, as mentioned, we'll talk a little bit about SBOM and include the requisite slide from the Biden administration's executive order last year. It highlights the level of scrutiny that's rightly starting to exist around the impact of software supply chain attacks. Not that the federal government is the best at defining actionable requirements. As a former servant of the people for 8 years, I can attest to that, but it kind of just shows you the high level that this problem has gone to. So, and essentially for those that don't know, an SBOM, software bill of materials, essentially contains the components that make up your application. And they should cover both direct and transitive dependencies, which are dependencies that are dependent upon your dependencies. So got that requisite slide out of the way. Awesome. Now, so let's talk more about SBOM. It's not a magic bullet. We need to know what it does, what it doesn't do. It does provide visibility into the makeup of your applications, the components that you're using. Like I said, the transitive dependencies as well. And it can help mitigate panic. Obviously, there's an asterisk there. Yeah, so it helps mitigate panic, especially on those inevitable Friday afternoons when a new vulnerability is disclosed. You can go check out, see if that's in your active SBOM. Maybe relax a little, but not fully, because what an SBOM doesn't do, it doesn't prevent a software supply chain attack, provides a visibility, and more importantly, it doesn't audit itself. So you've got to think about how your SBOMs are being generated and how much trust you're putting into that process. So it most certainly a requirement, but just realize it's not foolproof. You can't read down your SBOM and leave work on Friday and forget about the problem. So that being said, there are some good tools out there, and it's exciting to see new development around the topic. Sift and Sneak, and a bunch of built-in tools that we will talk about that you probably already have access to. So with GitHub, GitLab offer pretty similar feature sets. With GitHub, you've got the dependency graph, which will show dependencies and dependents. It detects in your projects, and it does that by just analyzing your manifest and log files. So sometimes there's some issues there. If your dependency graph isn't being populated, take a look at those files, make sure they're properly formatted and complete. Dependabot takes those dependencies, checks them against vulnerabilities in their advisor database, and will automate the creation of PRs for you to go in and then implement a upgrade to the dependency. So that's pretty cool. And then finally, secret scanning. This kind of goes back to helping prevent a compromise along your own software supply chain by identifying any accidentally included secrets in your code base. That could be for CI/CD platforms, for example.
And I will add to that, especially with Git, when you accidentally commit a secret, it's there forever unless you properly clean it.
Yeah, that's it.
On internal pen tests, I have retrieved credentials from old Git commits and have used them to compromise networks. So If you remove something, it has to be removed everywhere, and that includes everybody recloning that repository. It's not enough just to remove it. It's not enough just to overwrite it and commit.
Yes, exactly. Certainly, yeah. There's a couple tools that will kind of help you, but then you've got to delete the entire file and the history, and like it's a pain in the butt. GitHub has released, I think it might still be in beta, but a pre-commit tool that will actually scan your code before you push it to GitHub. So kind of trying to address that problem, finding secrets before they get committed to Git history. So I anticipate we'll see that kind of popping up among the other providers and platforms as well. On the GitLab side, pretty similar feature set, dependency list. We'll show your dependency tree, as well as any identified known vulnerabilities. Also provides dependency scanning, lets you know of any known vulnerable packages out there. And then they also offer a secrets detection. And then last but not least, like Mike mentioned, commit citing, vital, requiring verified commits for pushes. Not hard to set up and super effective. And I would add on that, yeah, blocking any merges that have committed secrets. All right, and then getting into continuous security. So everyone's heard the marketing term shift left, which makes sense. It is what it is. But what DevSecOps really allows for is just the further application of defense in depth principles through the introduction of layered security controls earlier in the development process. So nothing new there. Defense in depth, we're just trying to expand it, as far left as the developer's laptop to catch those bugs quicker, faster, just so we reduce the risk of introducing vulnerabilities in production. It just drastically increases the time and expense of remediating. We touched on it a bit in the previous slide, but software composition analysis identifies dependencies in your projects, assesses them for known vulnerabilities. You should be doing the same thing for container images you're using. Most of the source code management platforms are offering this capability now. There are also a ton of tools to implement this into CI/CD processes and failure builds if a vulnerable package is found. And these are really just foundational DevSecOps practices, integrating controls throughout the development process and really leveraging those automation tools that you're likely already using. Secret managements we've touched on, works to prevent malicious code injection to the compromise of legitimate accounts, context and isolation, traditional concept, just making sure your environments are segmented, including your build and deployment platforms, and then continuous monitoring. Really important with the sprawl of multiple platforms across multiple vendors. And it's certainly a challenge to bring in all those logs from different platforms and perform, legitimate monitoring that produces, some worthwhile detections is very important. So we've been a little doom and gloom so far. I'd like to share a little bit of good news. So we kind of talked about how high profile software supply chain attacks have become. And one silver lining of that is all of the exciting development going on in the space. A ton of new projects are popping up, tools. So SALSA is a kind of a joint venture, vendor neutral attempt at creating an end-to-end framework for ensuring artifact integrity throughout the entire software supply chain. Stands for software chain levels for software artifacts. I think they just like SALSA and worked back from there. But it will definitely be exciting to see how that project continues to grow. Certainly will be some hurdles adopting that framework. I think currently it's kind of aimed at middle to high end maturity organizations. And then the Alpha Omega project from OpenSSF, trying to address the issue of finally giving open source maintainers some support in securing their projects. We talked earlier about how it's often a side project, part-time. They don't, their main focus is on functionality. So Alpha Omega is trying to provide some outside security assistance for those projects in the vein of setting up automated testing, using scorecards, and then providing actual hands-on consultative work to identify vulnerabilities in the most critical and widely used projects. So finally getting open source maintainers some support that they need. And that one is also backed by some of the major software companies, Google and IBM, I think, and a few others. And I'll pass it back to Mike.
All right, so we'll go back a little bit to doom and gloom in that, like any defense, you have to realize that if you're always following the attacker, if you're always going to be on the back foot because there's going to be some vulnerability that you're unaware of. Windows, for example, Patch Tuesday is coming up. That there is a security fix in there for something that you don't know about and may not be public knowledge. So in order to avoid, with that knowledge, you need to have the ability to detect activity. So if you look at supply chain attacks, there are three main things that they're trying to accomplish. They are either destroying data, they are exfiltrating data, or they are providing access to a malicious user. Those are the three primary goals of most of these attacks. So backups are important because if somebody destroys your data, you need to be able to recover it. And remember that you don't have a backup if you can't recover it. So test your backups and set up your defense team needs to be in a position where they can detect things like data exfiltration, where they can detect the activities of an intruder who has gained access to your network, where you're looking for the password sprays, where you're looking for that odd access, like that country shouldn't be, nobody from that country should be accessing our machines. So you're even beyond your developers, which is what this is really focused on, your blue teams need the resources to help because in a targeted attack, and we looked at this with Solarwinds and all the resources they have, and much of this is going to depend on your vertical, on whether or not you're a target of an APT. But if you are, it's just incredibly hard to defend against that initial vector because they have so many resources, but you can catch them once they're in. And once you've done that, you're able to stop that attack. So that goes a little beyond the software supply chain, but that's your final defense for anything that gets missed. Now, we did have a few questions pop up.
Yeah, and I can kind of rapid fire maybe. I know we're running short on time.
Do we want to just go over these questions real quick and
Yeah, I can
do some Q&A?
Run down.
All right, so we have, you mentioned companies making their own repository rather than allow downloads straight from the internet. Doesn't work out well. Are there paid services that do that? I am not aware of any, but that doesn't mean they don't. Mitch?
Yeah, I would second that. As far as automating, pulling in package updates.
Yeah, and them doing the heavy lifting for you. If you're looking to start a company, that might be something to do. I bet you could sell that service. But I'm not aware of anybody right now that does it. And I'm aware of very few organizations that do it themselves and have maintained it for a long period. Those that do often have IT budgets that are larger than most companies' total budgets. Could the team do a follow-up presentation or give examples of extensions or tools devs can use in their IDEs or early in the pipeline to scan or validate code, libs or bins? We could look into doing that. I know from a Python standpoint, I use Bandit, which really is a scanner for best practices. It catches things like unhandled exceptions and stuff that you might let slide. I'm not as up to date on certain other languages.
Yeah, I've used Sneak in the past. I've also used SemGrep's a good one to look at. Yeah, those are the two off the top of my head.
But yeah, that might be a good topic for another presentation.
Yeah. I also see some additional questions over here in the chat. How are DevSecOps practices improving the software supply chain? I think mainly being able to integrate testing earlier in the development process, kind of like we covered, performing scans and analysis on developer machines before the code gets pushed to the Git repository is huge. And then, doubling that up and adding automated testing to your CI/CD platforms. And then more importantly, on top of that, doing something with the results, right? So you can check box that, yes, we've got SAST and DAST testing and software composition analysis testing, but are those results being ignored? Are they being fixed? So that's where, gathering metrics is vital to identifying the effectiveness of those tools once you have installed them. How are cloud technologies such as containers and Kubernetes impacting the shift to DevSecOps?
It's pretty heavy. Containers,
yeah.
it's the big buzzword now.
Yeah.
I don't know if any of you have ever tried to stand up a Kubernetes cluster, but unless it's somebody else is managing it, it's a whole other level of pain.
Yeah, and I would add on top of that, especially with Kubernetes, the complexity that introduces. You really need to have specialists on your team that are Kubernetes security specialists, just because it does drastically increase the complexity. So that there's just a ton more issues that introduces.
But it also drastically increases the ability of the dev team to develop quickly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's definitely some value.
So there's definitely value, but you have to be careful. And I see where companies go one of two ways, where they build every container themselves from a base Alpine image, for example, and every piece of that is controlled. But more and more for speed, we'll just download another image that appears to be okay. From say the Docker hub, and you don't necessarily have visibility into what's going on there. Okay, we have you said technology for monitoring for shadow IT cloud services is too expensive for some companies, but that relying on financial auditors to find out is a bad solution. What's your best recommendation? Unfortunately, my best recommendation is going to involve a little bit of development, and it's something that I did at a previous org I was with. Where I wrote my own Python script, and I used bot03, which was my example here, to go out every day and pull all of the resources, and then I would compare them against the previous day. And it would generate a report that would let me know all the buckets that were created, all of the EC2 containers that were spun up, any new databases, that kind of thing. And so I basically had a daily report that I could review. If you're big enough that that's too much to dig into, you probably actually have the resources to purchase that. But for a smaller company, scripting something yourself isn't too difficult to pull down all the resources you need and be able to compare those. It took me half a day to write that up and code everything from scratch.
Cool. Well, that looks like the remaining questions. We are getting close on time, so I guess we can go ahead and
Yeah.
wrap this up, Stephen.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you both for all the knowledge you shared today. Really appreciate it. I'm getting a lot of good feedback here. So that's great. And I wanted to thank everyone else for coming as well. And definitely check us out again. It'll be on YouTube for additional downloads if you need to go back and look at anything. So once again, thanks guys, and thanks everyone for joining. Have a great day.